You know, the most fascinating thing about Hani Yanagihara here is that her mother was originally a lesbian. Hey, it's Zulkef and you're watching Zulkef Plus. You know, shit has to really go down for me to end my hiatus and come on here to talk about something. Today we are going to be talking about A Little Life, a novel by Hani Yanagihara that spans over 800 pages and people love to shit on this book. Before we get into this video, I would like to give out a few disclaimers. First of all, we are going to be talking about some really heavy topics within this video, so I will put up a content warning list so you can check them out. Secondly, this video is not really a debate, so if you're easily offended, bye bye. And lastly, this is going to be a very spoilery discussion, so in case you haven't read this book and want to give it a go, you may leave this video. Honestly, after all these disclaimers, this just sounds like I want people to leave my video. But if you're still here, bear it with me because we have some really interesting things to talk about today. I will get to the plot of this book in a while, but firstly, I want to talk about a little bit of background of me with this book. The book first came out in 2015, around the same time as The Goldfinch, and this was one of those two big books that I was really interested in reading. I got around reading it in around 2018. That's when I absolutely fell in love with this book and didn't really think too deep about it. Back then it also used to be very popular, just not as much as it is right now. It actually happened during the COVID pandemic in 2020 when BookTok got its rise. It used to have fairly positive reviews. People used to label this book as the most tragic book of all time. There weren't really any think pieces surrounding this book. Most of the major publications gave it positive reviews and honestly there was no drama. People on TikTok love to act as an expert on everything, and this book has a lot of things going on, so everybody has to just act as an expert on everything. There are really polarizing reviews now on Goodreads as well as on TikTok. You know that Sabrina Carpenter tweets how it sounds like when people are talking about A Little Life. You guys are disgusting and weird for defending a little weirdo. I'm 17 and afraid of Hanya Yanagihara when she's writing. You guys need help. There are a lot of labels associated with A Little Life, and people online love to call this book torture porn as well as AO3 quality as well as Wattpad fanfiction behavior, so much so that major publications like The Guardian and Medium have asked if these terms are actually true when talking about this book. I think the entire point of calling this book torture porn is very redundant, and I think it causes more harm than actually talking about the topics in a positive sense. I don't think this is doing any activism. When talking about this book, people have called it euthanasia fanfiction, though I do agree with a lot of points made in the video. As well as Goodreads review has called it the definitive harbinger of wokeness. Meanwhile, some reviewers called it queerphobic and ableist. Some of these points I do agree with, while others are just too far-fetched in my opinion. The problem is that people love to call it torture porn while having no idea what the term actually implements, and they don't even have any harmful intention most of the times. Torture porn is a term that is used to define a genre of horror films in which sadistic violence or torture is a central aspect of the plot. A Little Life does talk about a lot of serious topics, but never in a sense that it's supposed to be a source of gratification, and I think that's where the term really falls flat when we're talking about A Little Life. It just sounds like you are not educated enough on the topics you're talking about, and overall just makes you sound dumb. Though I would also like to talk about how Hanya Yanagihara has in numerous interviews discussed about the fact that she did absolutely zero research while writing this book, but to go as far as calling this book torture porn, I just think it's a little too much. Now let's talk about what actually happens in A Little Life. This book follows four friends, Jude, JB, Malcolm, and Willem. We follow them throughout several decades of their lives. Their friendship started back in college when the four shared a dorm. However, for the most part, the book talks about Jude, who is the most vulnerable out of the four. He is also the most mysterious one out of the four. He has a limp that he does not really want to talk about, and his friends know that he has a very mysterious past and they never mention it around him. Jude is a public litigator at the Justice Department. Willem is a waiter while he's also an aspiring actor. We have JB, who is a painter. He's struggling at the beginning of the book, but later he becomes really successful. JB also have this internal conflict going on that he hasn't suffered enough to become a really great artist, which I think is really interesting. Malcolm is an architect and he comes from a really rich family, which really makes him a nepo baby. On a scale of 1 to Dakota Johnson, Malcolm really loves limes. The book opens up on Lispenard Street on New York, and we get a slice of life kind of story while Jude and Willem are moving into an apartment. The apartment is really bad in its construction. The apartment has clearly seen the best of its days already, and considering the fact that they have moved in and what is about to happen, It couldn't get any worse. Soon afterwards, it's New Year's Eve, and JB ends up throwing a party inviting every possible person that he knows in New York, and the four friends ends up locking up themselves on the rooftop. There is a little bit of this and a little bit of that as the story progresses, and in this part we really just get to know about the characters, and eventually at the end we get to know what the book is actually going to be about. Willem wakes Jude up in the middle of a night, and he has to take him to the hospital after he finds out that Jude has his arm wrapped around a towel and blood is dripping from it. And right from the get-go, you can tell that Jude is a coughing baby and life is a hydrogen bomb. After this incident, Jude and Willem become a little bit closer. It's more closer on the end of Willem's part than it is on the Jude, but I don't think that really matters. Other than that, the story starts to focus a little bit more on Jude from here. However, the others are aware that Jude has had something bad happen to him in the past and he has trauma regarding it, and they just don't talk about it because Jude used to be very reserved back in his college days. The core of this book is really how Jude has suffered so much in his life and how it continues to shape his relationships with people in his life, especially men. Throughout the novel, Jude repeatedly thinks that he cannot be loved because he's not capable of being loved. Something has to be missing in him. It is all because of his traumas and how people have treated him throughout his life. And then we have Harold, of course. Harold used to be Jude's teacher in college back in the day, and then he eventually adopts Jude. At first, Jude is very cautious as to why Harold decided to adopt him. He thinks that there must be some ulterior motive going on, but Jude is quickly proven wrong because Harold truly loves him and wants to just adopt him. Harold happens to have a wife as well. She's actually his second wife. Her name is Julia, but she's not really important. Hanya Yanagihara has mentioned it multiple times that the book is actually about male friendships, and I guess that can be taken as the reason for the lack of women in this book. On the Bechdel test, the book is really Lord of Flies on crack. Though Harold is against it, Jude ends up leaving the Justice Department and he joins a private firm that gets him a lot of money. Willem ends up becoming an actor and they're both able to move out of their Lisbonard Street apartment. Malcolm builds them a new luxurious apartment in a building of their friend, and both Jude and Willem move there. Malcolm doesn't really have anything going on other than the fact that he's working at his father's friend's firm. JB is a struggling artist at the beginning, but his career does eventually take off as he starts painting his friends, especially Jude as one of his French girls. Jude and JB are on an agreement that Jude will always approve the references before JB can paint them. However, JB goes behind Jude's back and ends up painting one of his photographs that Jude wasn't really comfortable with. This ends up with them having a fight. JB ends up mocking Jude, and that's how they basically have a temporary fallout. Once the book hits the 50% mark, it starts to go down. By this time, we know a little bit about Jude's past, but I will get to that in a little while. Halfway through the book, all of his friends and Harold start pressurizing Jude for having such a lonely life, and he ends up trying to find someone to date. He ends up meeting Caleb, who is a designer, and after a few dates, they start going out. At the beginning, Caleb is really nice, but eventually, of course, he ends up becoming a piece of shit. First, their relationship becomes toxic and then just downright abusive. Caleb is disapproving of Jude's disability even though he cannot do anything about it, and once Caleb finds out how Jude's body looks like, he just gets completely angry and beats him to the point that he has to be hospitalized. There are graphic depictions of abuse as it continues to happen again and again between Caleb and Jude, and while all of this happening, most of his friends are away or unaware that what is going on in Jude's life. Once he is hospitalized, the truth gets out and everyone sort of just blames themselves in their own quiet ways, and as that continues to happen, Jude starts spiraling because he also thinks that he is to be blamed for having all of that happen to him. Eventually, Jude ends up writing a bunch of suicide notes to his friends and Harold and tries to commit suicide, but that is a failed attempt as he is discovered by Richard, who is the building's owner and Jude's friend. He is once again taken to the hospital. Since Willem shares the apartment with Jude, he sort of blames himself and thinks that it's all his fault for being away all the time. So Willem just stays away from work for a while and returns to New York and starts living with Jude as he wants to take care of him. All while this is happening, JB and Jude are still not on talking terms. This really affects JB in a sense that he thinks that Willem is more close to Jude than JB is to Jude, and that really takes a toll on him. While they are living together again, Willem catches feelings for Jude, asks him out, and since Jude doesn't know how to say no to everyone who asks him of anything, of course he says yes. All of this happens in the chapter titled The Happy Years, but you best not believe Hanya Yanagihara because of the way the chapter actually ends. We get to see Jude and Willem navigate their relationship. They end up building a home in the forest, which is really significant to the Jude's backstory, but I will get back to that again when we're talking about the backstory. Willem also ends up finding out that Jude is really repulsed by sex, and they end up opening the relationship for Willem's sake. At the end of the happy years, Willem, Malcolm, and Malcolm's wife, who he got married to at some point in this book, are driving in a car and a truck runs into them. Jude gets his legs amputated as well, and the book just goes further downhill from this point onwards. Since Jude is a lawyer, he goes after the truck driver and the company and possibly every person he can get his hands on and blame for Willem's death. JB and Jude are back to being friends, and at one of his exhibitions, JB tries to kiss Jude in hopes of consoling him, but of course that doesn't really work out. Towards the end of the book, Jude gets more and more sick and he eventually ends up killing himself. We hear the remainder of the story from Harold, who is talking to Willem throughout the book in several chapters, but now that Willem is dead, we end up finding out that Harold was actually talking to a painting of Willem that JB had painted. The book comes to a close with Harold talking about one of his walks with Jude that he took over Lispenard Street when Jude told him the story of the New Year party when the four got locked up, in a way that brings the story to a full circle. Now let's talk about the backstory. With the main story out of the way, we can talk about Jude's past, which is really extensive, and here is where the meat of the story lies. Though we do get to see JB as he navigates his life outside of his friendship with the other three, we also get to see Malcolm and how his life is at home. We also learn that Willem comes from a ranch in Wyoming, all while we're also seeing huge chunks of Jude's past. We learned that as a baby, Jude was abandoned near a dumpster and he was found by a bunch of monks. The monks take him to the monastery, and that is where he lived most of his primitive years. All of the monks at the monastery end up physically and psychologically abusing Jude for years but one. Brother Luke, who tends to the greenhouse of the monastery, is really nice towards Jude, and he ends up forming a plan with him to run away from the monastery so he can be away from the other monks. Once they are successfully out of the monastery, the two run off to motel. Brother Luke pimps Jude out to different men and the cycle of prostitution begins. They go from motel to motel across different sections of America, and it just goes on for a while. At first, Brother Luke tells Jude that this is not going to last for long, as Brother Luke is constantly looking for a job, and once he gets it, he's going to move Jude to a cabin in the woods. Now here comes the fantasy that Jude has, that he's going to live in a cabin in the woods that eventually he ends up making with Willem. But of course, this is not how exactly it ends. Brother Luke keeps on bringing more and more men that keep on raping Jude, and this just goes on for a few years. Eventually, the motel that they're staying at ends up getting raided by the police, but before the police can get to Brother Luke, he ends up hanging himself, leaving Jude alone. Jude is then sent to a home where the counselors already know what has happened to him, and they subject him to a similar fate. After being physically abused by the counselors, Jude ends up trying to run away, and he is successful in doing so. However, he does not have anyone else to rely on but himself, so he takes rides from truck drivers, in return offering them sexual favors. By this point, he has contracted a lot of STDs and ends up passing out in public. When he wakes up, he finds himself in the home prison of Dr. Traylor. Now, Dr. Traylor at first gives Jude a lot of food and antibiotics and helps him regain his health. He tells him of all the medical conditions that he's in at that point. Once Jude regains his health, Dr. Traylor is no different than the other men that has been in his life and starts physically and sexually abusing Jude. Once again, Jude runs away, this time from Dr. Traylor's home, but Dr. Traylor ends up catching up on him. Instead of bringing him back to his home, Dr. Traylor lets him go. But before he can let him go, he runs him over by his car, which ends up with Jude having a permanent limp in his legs. Now when Jude wakes up, he is in a hospital, and this is the first time he has anyone kind to him in his life that doesn't want any sexual favor in return. This is a woman named Anna who is a social worker, and she helps Jude prepare for college. Eventually, Anna dies as well, and Jude goes to college where he meets the rest of his friends. Now let's talk about Is Little Life torture porn? As I already mentioned previously, people online love to label this book as torture porn. As I have mentioned earlier, people online love to call this book torture porn, but if you ask me, I don't think that's the correct term to call this book. I don't think that people actually understand the implication of the word when they're talking about this book in regards to torture porn. This term gets thrown around a lot, primarily because I think this book discomforts the reader with intense trauma and physical torture that the main character of the book, Jude, has to go through. Other than that, I think this term got really popular, which just made people to bandwagon on this term and start calling this book torture porn. In his 1962 essay, The Creative Process, James Baldwin said, "You think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read." Jude suffers extremely in this novel, but if you look at the positive reviews that the people have given to this book, they seem to relate to his pain, or at least they seem to have some sort of empathy towards the main character. Meanwhile, when you look at the negative reviews of this book, you will find a lot of people talking about this book for having too much trauma. Which brings me to the question, how much trauma is too much trauma to be depicted in literature? In The Pleasure of Text, Ronald Barthes said, "To read is to engage in a difficult and unpredictable process of significance." In the novel, Jude goes through a lot of abuse in his childhood as well as in his adulthood. In the novel, Jude goes through a lot of abuse in his childhood as well as in his adulthood, and I think to discard all of that under the term of torture porn or saying that it's too much, I think it diminishes the ground reality of the abuse that children have to go through in this world. TikTok and Goodreads reviews are recycling the same buzzwords that they have heard from other reviewers and forming no new opinions with any nuance, and I think that is really harmful when you're talking about these sensitive topics. While I will also like to talk about the people who love this book but label this book as sad girl book, I think that is also very demeaning and defeats the entire purpose of the book, which is really empathy and the amount of torture that exists in this world. We all know that intent does not equate impact. The author had some intents while writing this book that I personally do not agree with, and I'm sure that you don't as well. For instance, she did not do any research while writing this book and just wanted to write a story where the main character was tortured to the point where he ends up killing himself. But I think the way we are talking about this book really demeans the entire purpose and also just hurts the community as well as the topics that we are trying to raise awareness about. Is A Little Life unrealistic? The most tired and redundant issue that readers seem to have with A Little Life is the fact that the book is simply too unrealistic. This really makes me question the lack of awareness that people have regarding the world that they're living in, considering the fact that we literally have a state that detains children and tortures them for years. According to National Children's Alliance, 1 billion children are estimated to have experienced some sort of sexual abuse. However, there is also criticism regarding Jude's abuse continuing into his adult life once he has grown up. People who suffer sexual abuse at a young age are highly prone to experiencing some sort of abuse or neglect in their adult life. And since the book is set in America, I would like to add that according to DVCCC, every year approximately 4 million older Americans are victim to physical and psychological abuse and neglect. The complaint that too much happens to Jude is simply a code for I cannot handle this level of pain without any narrative resolution. You don't see people complaining about Oedipus or King Lear or the other Greek tragedies where people kill themselves for the sake of fate, but when a contemporary queer man is suffering too much, it's suddenly bad writing. What people are calling unrealistic in A Little Life is actually amplified emotional truth. This is a literary tradition that is older than the novel itself. Through the decades and centuries, so many classical novels depict violence and torture, but I don't know why we have to single out A Little Life just because we think it's too much. Even the author has expressed this in several interviews of hers that she wasn't trying to achieve some sort of realness in this book, but actually she was just aiming for emotional truth. People often tend to discard this book, acting as if this was supposed to be a documentary on queerness. In fact, the book aims for emotional maximalism. Its sole purpose was to evoke some sort of empathy from its reader, which I think it does perfectly because we've all seen tons of people crying over this book on TikTok as well as on YouTube and Bookstagram. The ending made me angry crowd. When you look at the negative reviews of A Little Life, we see two types of people. First is the category who read this book halfway through and decided to DNF. Then we also have the people who read it all the way to the end and got mad at the ending. A Little Life is not a happy story, and of course it does not have a happy ending. Jude ends up killing himself in the book, but it is indicated as some sort of failure at life. If you have read A Little Life and you were thinking there was going to be some sort of healing or a narrative resolution at the end, I just think you need a little bit more of that media literacy. When Hanya Yanagihara was asked in an interview if Jude was even capable of having happiness, she simply just answered that Jude was the kind of character who had happiness taken out of him, and surprisingly that's exactly what happens to him in the novel. You just cannot expect him to have healing despite suffering. Throughout the novel it showed repeatedly that he is not really getting over everything that he had in his life. And the fact that people have this argument that he ends up killing himself is a really weak argument considering the statistics that we have provided about suicide rates. People do suffer a lot in this world, and sadly some of them end up killing themselves. There are also a lot of people who felt cheated by the ending, which I do think is a little too much. Right from the start, it's very clear where this book is headed. Yet readers expect to have this book some sort of healing or reward for them after they have endured those 800 pages of absolute pain. If you are that kind of reader, I just think it says more about you as a reader than the book itself. Most of the time, I think the ending of A Little Life is fine, but it just infuriates the reader because it doesn't flatter them. It does not offer any catharsis, it does not offer any justice or closure or any sort of healing. In fact, the ending of A Little Life offers you just truth, and I just don't think people want it. I think that people just want closure. Not offering any consolation in the end is nothing new to literary fiction, and the kind of story Hanya Yanagihara wanted to say, there wasn't simply going to be any happy ending. Susan Sontag has said real art has the capacity to make us nervous. A Little Life does not play into the reader's face. In fact, it does not shy away from the truth. The book builds up to Jude committing suicide, and that's exactly how it ends. Perhaps you could say that the author played into the reader's face if the book actually did not build up to that. The moral of the story is that no amount of love can help you get over your suffering if you are yourself incapable of getting over your suffering. And I think that's a very important message that people tend to overlook. I think it's really weird how people get mad at the ending when Jude kills himself instead of getting mad at all the situations that lead him to that point. These are the situations that are very much existing in the real world. People talk about that book as if there is not all that suffering existing within the world that we're currently living in. This is usually where the argument of the book being too much comes in and just derails the reader from the entire plot of the book. Bad representation. A Little Life is a bad representation fest, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. It lacks diversity and tries to bottle up queerness in heteronormative roles. For instance, queer women are never taken seriously within this book, and bisexuality is simply not a thing when Willem is pretty much what we do categorize as that. The book also heavily implies that queerness is something that people decide, or they have a choice to be queer or not be queer. People have also criticized this book for having bad representation of queer men, but I low-key disagree with that. People come in all shapes and forms and types, and I think disregarding a character's sexuality just because it's unconventional is a very loose argument. New York has a long history of queer culture, but it is mostly absent from this book even when it is really necessary in the context of this novel. However, Jude's queerness is not the main point of this book, and he is really sexually repulsed due to his past experiences of abuse and rape. Still, a little research would have taken the author a long way. As I've mentioned earlier, she has added in numerous interviews that she did no research while writing this book. The lack of research by the author really makes the queerness in this book redundant more than actual representation. Meanwhile, the book also reinforces the good gay versus the bad gay trope. Every man who is ever romantically interested in Jude ends up being a rapist. Meanwhile, we only have the other option of Willem, who is technically bisexual if we make it a stretch. However, Hanya Yanagihara never bothers to explore that aspect of Willem, and by the time this happens in the book, Willem is not even the main character anymore. Now you must be wondering, why am I so insistent on validating this book? To answer that question, even if the book is really problematic, it still manages to get a lot of things right. The entire point of why I made this video is because of the way people react to this book. I think it's really harmful the way people are labeling it and the way people are over-analyzing it. I haven't read any other Hanya Yanagihara book, and I also don't plan on reading it because personally I don't align with a lot of her philosophies. However, ever since the day I read the book until date, I have loved A Little Life for the kind of emotions that it evokes from me and the way it makes me feel empathy for its main character, as well as it also makes me feel seen in a way that no other book has ever done. So, is the book bad, or are you a bad reader? Honestly, in context of A Little Life, I think both can be true. It's also a bad book and you're also a bad reader. I have seen a lot of people making valid criticism points when they're talking about this book, other than those who have just those recycled takes that they heard from a video or seen in somebody else's TikTok. Personally, I really dislike it when people use the same buzzwords when they're talking about this book. People are obviously entitled to their own opinions and they can talk about whatever they want, and you can't really patronize them over it, but I do think the way people are labeling this book as torture porn is a little too much and harmful. The reason I wanted to make this video was to talk about how a lot of people have talking points that are really redundant and I think ignorant. This book has a lot of torture, and I agree with that. It has bad representation, I also agree with that. But there is also a lot of love in this book, and the book forces you to really feel empathetic towards this character, and I think if you overlook that, you kinda miss the entire point of this book. Also, not every book is for every reader, and this book simply might not just be for you. You might just not fall in line with the vibe of this book or whatever, and that's okay as well. After all, reading and art is all subjective, and you can have a different opinion as me on things. That is not the point of this video. If you personally felt attacked while I was talking about A Little Life in this book, then I'm really sorry, but if the shoe fits, LOL.